So let's talk about the actual steps to create your test automation strategy. We want to be able to have some actionable items that we could take away here. So, what are some things you can do, leaving this talk to help start creating your test automation strategy? So first is, gaining business alignment. If you've got the idea, you understand, kind of generally where you want to go, and you say, hey, we believe this is a good idea. Bump that up against what we like to call your high business value test. And what your high business value test essentially is, what is a flow that if it stopped working, it could potentially cause the business to fail. I like to use the example of Knight Capital. If you're a testing professional, you've never heard those words together, or you understand the history of that company. It's essentially a company that went from a trading company, New York Stock Exchange. They went from fully functional to belly up in 45 minutes, and they lost $480 million due to one software bug. So that obviously was a high business value test that was potentially not considered. And you look at other types of scenarios where you say, okay, then maybe things like if you're an e-com site, it's checking out, it's creating an account, being able to view products. And make sure that you work with your business to understand what those high business value tests are, because it will allow you to say, is the solution that we're proposing, does that match the critical scenarios we have? And if the answer is no, maybe you need to go back to the drawing board. But if you don't have those conversations, you won't be able to say, we are providing business value with our automation framework, and that will allow you to also drive into your ROI conversation as well. Next is, we want to take those that high business value, those test cases, along with the other test cases that may be designed, or testing strategies or requirements, user stories, and identify your risk. I am a big fan of risk-based approach to testing overall, and the same can be said for test automation. What is the impact, added to the probability that something is going to happen, that essentially allow you to define your risk. You can use your risk-based approach to say, hey, if we're developing this new solution, or we have a testing strategy, we need to figure out what to test first. We need to figure out how to have an answer to that testing squeeze. We can list out the risk, or the risk impacts to those test cases, to that test technology, to say, hey, these are the things we really should automate first. This is what makes the most sense. They're critical business flows, they're critical business items, and we should focus on those. And by having those defined in your test strategy, you'll not only be able to say, yes, what we're doing is important, but you'll also be able to say, hey, when it comes down to it, what would the impact be if we had to cut a week off of your testing cycle? Well, you could say, well, we wouldn't be able to get to these items, and several of them are high risk, so maybe we need to make some adjustments. Or you could say, I really don't recommend cutting a week off because we're going to miss out on these high risk items. So, having that risk-based approach is very, very important to helping to determine that priority, as well as to be able to answer that question of, when you get into that testing squeeze, what gets cut first? Next is, kind of understanding your technologies, your tools, your people, your platforms, your environments, right? Really kind of understanding, what is going on here when it comes to, your overall solution. How is the impact of your solution going to affect your environment, right? Do you have the proper accounts to run this? Do you have the proper, environmental access? Do you have the proper libraries and APIs and various pieces that you may need to have your test automation solution talk to your application? A lot of times we see that people may need things like service accounts, or tokens, or keys to be able to communicate effectively with an application. So you want to be able to have that conversation of, okay, what do we need to make sure that this is working, instead of just having, hey, we've got this automation framework, and it's just going to magically connect into and have a conversation with the application. There's a lot of times it doesn't work out that well. You need to have a good working solution that you can build in that is robust. So one of the big things I see where teams potentially fall down by not doing this is they build in, we'll use a very specific example in Selenium. They build in individual login logic to each one of their tests, or to even a smaller group of tests, instead of saying, hey, is there a way that we can have some sort of larger structure here, where we could say, maybe we need to put this up and call that function of login that has all of the logic. It's got the keys, it's got the user, login information. So that way we only have to change it once. But if we don't plan for something like that up front, we're going to wind up having a lot of broken tests, a lot of fragile tests as well. So it's really important to kind of understand, what is your ecosystem? How are the people using it? What are the tools that might be required to implement that solution as well? This is one that I definitely see overlooked quite a bit, especially this last bullet point here of retry logic. I see a lot of automation frameworks that are very, very good, but then fail due to data failures. And a lot of times they say, well, a lot of times the data failure is maybe someone changed my data and I didn't know it, and so we failed it, and that entire script that was supposed to run overnight, or suite that was supposed to run overnight, it just failed. So what if you had the ability to say, identify if the data is correct with potentially another script in your automation framework, or run some pre-scripts to validate the data, or to load the data, and that could potentially save you hours and hours of rewriting fragile tests, or even having to rerun your tests. But if you don't think about that up front, and you don't put that into your strategy of how's the data stored, do we have to worry about masking or de-identifying data? Where are we getting it? Are we using an Excel sheet? Are we using a SQL database? What are we doing here? As well as having that retry logic, you're going to find yourself, kind of going back and backhauling and, doing some rework on your framework architecture to try to figure out how that works. So really encourage you for, each release, each, big iteration of your framework to really take a look at how are we handling data? How does this work from an overall framework in terms of, do we need to have, separate libraries or functions that the tests call, or can the test individually handle this? So, just something to definitely keep in mind there. Next, then, this is definitely one that we're seeing, really come up and be very important and impactful to test automation teams in terms of, how do you kick your tests off? It used to be, I would write my scripts and it would kind of go into a black hole, and then, some results would populate and happen, and everyone would be, more often than not, kind of asking why the test failed instead of, happy and sunshine. But now we find that a lot of testers are able to, work directly with, Jenkins servers. They're able to work directly with, other, build and deploy tools, GitHub Actions, various, different types of things. And so if that's the case, you need to define that in your test automation strategy. Where is the code stored? So many times I still see that code is stored on laptops. It's not stored in a code repository. It doesn't have basic security scanning on it. It doesn't have basic code quality scanning on it. I mean, your test automation code is code, and it should be treated as such. So it really then falls into that DevSecOps pipeline of where is it stored? How are we building it? How are we deploying it? What environments is it running on? Are we scanning our own code? I have actually found major security flaws inside of multiple automation frameworks to where ports were left open on test boxes or test VMs, or the way that it was calling something, it was calling an external library that had malware built into it. So I'm sorry, it was calling an open source library that had malware built into it. So you need to be doing some level of security scanning, and you need to have a process for how that is done for your test automation framework as well. And then, again, as I mentioned here before, are the libraries you're using, is the open source code you're using secure? Again, it's one of the reasons why I, really like Catalan from our side. That it's secure, that it's gone through its paces, that it's been tested. And, it's something that, works. But you don't necessarily have to worry about that. But, if you're using some, measure of libraries or open source code, I highly recommend you take a look at how those are being used, as well as what scanning do you have in place. There's a lot of open source scanning tools. You don't have to pay for them if you're a small company, or if you're a larger company, hook into things like a Veracode or Source Code or SonarQube from that standpoint. Next is, we talked about this a little bit ago, but, really wanted to hit as this is something that absolutely must be, its own section here. Is what are your environmental considerations? Do you need, certain tokens? Do you need, VPNs? Do you need to have some sort of, launch box, or, a box that potentially sits outside of your network that launches your test into, Sauce Labs or whatever other browser tool you may have, or, kicking off Docker containers or images that potentially have, browser images or OS images? How does that work? Where does that live, right? Who's responsible for that? How is the patching done on those systems? Is it something that we spin up on demand? Are we using preemptible VMs? So, you want to make sure that you're documenting that, because it will really help you get your mind around that. And one of the biggest things that I see with this really helps with onboarding new testers to your organization. Because a lot of times what takes the longest is getting those access done, getting those, the VPN set up, getting the logins created. And a lot of times things are missed. And so they're left saying, well, my script is not running, but I really don't know why. It's saying, maybe I don't have access and I don't really know why it's not documented anywhere. So you really want to make sure that you truly understand where your code is running at all times. I have seen code accidentally run in production because there wasn't much, documented around that. And sometimes you really don't want to do that from a test automation standpoint. Sometimes it's okay, depending on where you work for. But you want to make sure that you really understand where that's happening and you have it documented. Very, very important to have that documented. This is one of my favorite ones. Absolutely. This has saved my bacon so many times. Having the ability to tag your tests and logically group them will allow you to say, it doesn't matter whether we have 20,000 or 50,000 test automation scripts. I know that these over here are for my checkout. I know that these over here are for my login. These are for smoke, certification, Insprint, whatever it might be. But if you don't have those tagged, then you're oftentimes left with, what do I run, right? Without having to look into the individual test script to say, what was this supposed to be doing? Which takes a lot of time. Trust me, it takes a lot of time. So if you don't have those tags, you're left doing all of that groundwork, trying to figure out. If you're, new to the organization, trying to figure out what is the purpose of a test. If you don't have those tags, you may not know. Someone says, hey, we need to run our smoke test. You're like, well, give me a few hours. I'll get back to you. Just need to comb through 20,000 tests. So one of the things that I highly recommend that you have up front in your test automation strategy is what we like to call a tagging agreement, to where you say, hey, instead of saying, cert, we're going to say certification. That way, when we run things, or maybe we want to kick off certain builds instead of Jenkins, you can actually pass parameters to say run all certification builds. But if you have someone over here labeling a C, someone over here labeling a cert, someone over here labeling a certification, you're going to have, essentially useless tags. So you need to have a tagging agreement that'll have your most common tags. Oftentimes I'll see these updated every release or every sprint, in terms of now we're adding new functionality. So maybe, inbox v2, or, login v2, or password reset v2, or whatever it might be, or password reset new, however you want to document that. But you want to make sure that you really kind of understand that process up front, and really try to drive your team into using test tags. It's highly, highly beneficial. One of the next things as well that, we really find is, as you do this more often, as you get more mature, especially for, some of the kind of more nimble, right, organizations that have the ability to have a lot of unit tests, a lot of integration tests, you're able to say, well, we're running this same logic in a unit or integration test or a lower level API test. So why do I need to run the automation script, right? It's taking an extra minute. Maybe I can shave 30 of those tests off. It saves 30 minutes on my test run. So you have the ability to kind of understand that. If you understand what your goal is, where you're focusing on, what your tags are, you're able to say, maybe we can find some efficiencies where we don't have all this overlapping tests. But without that documented, a lot of times what we find is, the unit tests sometimes are doing the same thing that the manual testing, that is sometimes doing the same thing as the automation testing. And you have 3 people hitting the exact same test. Is it really necessary? More than likely not. But you can see, if we reduce one, what is our impact? Do our defects go up? Does our time go down? Like where does that happen? So highly recommend you look for those efficiencies. Again, this is something that typically happens for teams that get a little bit more mature after following this process. But it was such an impactful thing for us that we wanted to put this in here because we have found significant time savings with really understanding your overall automation strategy, everything from that unit test all the way down to your UI test as well. So for those of you living in an agile world, safe, agile, Kanban, XP, whichever one you want to call it, I've got a couple of just little tips here. And for, those are my warriors, my waterfall warriors over here that are next, we have some considerations there for that next slide. So really for this one, one of the big things I'd like for you to really look at from an agile standpoint is to really try to embrace your agile and DevOps tools. Work on your documentation. GitHub is a wonderful documentation repository as well. I absolutely love it for that. You can also, have, good, documentation in Jira, Confluence, Qtest. There's a lot of, good options you can use that are cloud-based, that easy to share, have, information that is easy to access, easy to locate. And then, what I could also consider for Agile as well is, your test strategy is going to turn more into a living document where potentially it's updated and reviewed each sprint. It's not necessarily going to be, this is the document we're going to use for the next year. And more so, hey, let's review it. And are we changing? Are we having to pivot a little bit? Are we staying with our visions and our goals? Are we keeping, our technology charter and our test agreement, our tagging agreement the same? So, definitely, look at those cloud tools and really try to embrace that living document. I found that it makes folks' lives a little bit easier from an agile standpoint. Then from a waterfall standpoint, just because you have more time doesn't necessarily mean that you need a 150-page document. I'll repeat that for all of my waterfall warriors here, okay? Just because you have the time doesn't need to mean that you need to spend that time documenting everything. What you wind up with is a big bloated document that nobody wants to read. It gets out of date very easily, and people are gone. And then the strategy is just forgotten about and it's not followed. And then the next thing you want to have is regular check-ins. We like to call these, micro strategy sessions, to where you're talking about, the various pieces of the strategy. You're kind of understanding, hey, are you still using the strategy? Hey, do we need to update anything? So having those regular check-ins instead of just, using the proverbial throw it over the wall type of mentality that does typically go with waterfall, you're really kind of still, almost having an agile-based approach at how you're working with a team and making sure that they are really following that and that, they truly understand it.